Good evening, and welcome to the American Antiquarian Society's virtual public program, A Plausible Man, the true story of the escaped slave who inspired Uncle Tom's Cabin, with author Susanna Ashton. The American Antiquarian Society is located on the ancestral homelands of the Nipmuc tribal community, who remain an active presence here in central Massachusetts. I'm Scott Casper, president of the American Antiquarian Society. Our mission at AAS is to cultivate a deeper understanding of the American past, grounded in the primary sources we've been collecting since 1812. In addition to welcoming researchers from around the world to use the collections, both physical and digital, we host programs like tonight's that provide insights into the past and its resonance for our own day. This program is being recorded and it'll be available on YouTube on our YouTube page following the live stream. My colleague, Lauren Havelis, who is coordinating our technology this evening, will be posting some notes in the chat about how to order the book, how to ask questions using the Q&A function, which you can do at any point in the program. Please don't hesitate to use that. We thank you for joining us this evening, and as a nonprofit organization, we welcome any support you can provide to help keep this work going. Thank you. Now I am happy to introduce tonight's speaker, who is a familiar face at AAS, having done research here for many, many years. Susanna Ashton is professor of English at Clemson University. She's the author of Collaborators in Literary America, 1870 to 1920, and she's the editor of several editions of primary sources that amplify the voices of African Americans in South Carolina and beyond. These include I Belong to South Carolina Slave Narratives, The South Carolina Roots of African American Thought, a Reader, which is co-edited with Rhonda Robinson Thomas, and the forthcoming reissue of 28 Years a Slave, or My Life on Three Continents by Thomas Lewis Johnson. Among many other awards and grants, and I could go on at great length, but I'll just mention two. Susanna Ashton has been a W.E.B. Du Bois Fellow at Harvard's Hutchins Center for African and African American Studies, and a fellow at Yale's Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition. Equally important, her work has been featured in the New York Times, Smithsonian Magazine, the Wall Street Journal, and numerous other media outlets. She is truly a scholar who crosses those boundaries between the academic world and public scholarship, and it's a pleasure to welcome her back to AAS. Susanna Ashton, take it away.
Well, thank you so much, Scott. I appreciate it's a full circle for me. I think very early in my career, I became aware of the Antiquarian Society holdings and the possibilities. Well, very vaguely understanding what they all were. I started doing research on various projects and have had the privilege of coming back and forth over a couple of years. But for me, this is really a beautiful return. And with that in mind, I am going to walk you through quickly this quite big book, this fat book of mine. But what I'm going to do is, every audience, I sort of lean in on certain themes a little bit. And for you all folks, and I know many of you are virtual, but still, I'm going to be talking a little more about Massachusetts because there's a whole Massachusetts angle to this story, Western Massachusetts. There's sort of a special angle for Worcester and Springfield. So I'm going to be bringing that into the story. But let me screen share and we can try to get started. Let's see. Let's see. I'm going to screen share. Share. Here we go. And wait, it's coming. Let's see. I'm going to try one more time and I'm going to screen share. Don't worry. I'm a little slow, but it's going to work. There we go. Perfect. And there. Can you see everything just fine, I hope? Big blue screen? I'm going to assume yes. I can't really follow the chat, but I'll hope everything is good. All right.
Yeah.
So, my title, A Plausible Man, the true story of the escaped slave who inspired Uncle Tom's Cabin. I have to say it's a little clunky of a title perhaps in some ways, but what I really wanted to get at was uh, new ways to think about American literature, American history. I have a story of John Andrew Jackson, who is a man I'm sure none of you have ever heard of. That's all right. Now you will. I'm trying to bring a new figure into American history. And how he certainly crossed paths with Harriet Beecher Stowe. And I might have used the word instigate rather than inspire, but we'll see what words you think fit to this sort of very different angle on Uncle Tom's Cabin. But ultimately, the story I think I'm telling is about two books and about two lives. Because John Andrew Jackson, who was raised to believe he was nothing. He was supposed to be a machine and a machine for picking cotton under torture. And yet he grew to see himself as a man who could share, not just be a man. He always knew he was a man of reason and humanity, but he began to see that he was a man who could share and inspire and bear witness in a way that could impact the world around him. And so what brought him to that kind of belief in himself and his story is sometimes the emotional and ethical driving force for me in looking at his work. So let's get going. First of all, John Andrew Jackson was born around 1825, and I want to talk about the first couple of years until around 1847. He was born in Sumter, South Carolina, near an area called Black Creek. That's sort of inland, right? He's not on the coast, and that's important. He was enslaved by the English family, and they were particularly violent and horrifying people. There are all sorts of lawsuits and arrests and issues of which had nothing to do with enslaved people. I mean, all their neighbors hated them too. So believe me, the English was a very difficult family. Um, but he carved out joy and love in his life, like one does in hard circumstances. And he falls in love with a girl named Louisa, who's enslaved at an adjacent plantation labor camp. And they have a little girl named Ginny. His wife is forcibly remarried, is the word he uses, and you can imagine how horrible that must have been. And then she was sent away to Georgia. She and Ginny were sent away to Georgia. He is furious. Jackson is devastated, heartbroken, and importantly, I think he thinks he has nothing left to lose. And he flees. He gets himself a hold of a horse under quasi, legal, illegal circumstances. He gets a hold of a horse and he flees around Christmas in 1846. He makes it about 150 miles to the coast to Charleston. And there he sort of hangs out in Charleston for a little while until he can figure out a way to get on a boat. He knows he can't hang, he doesn't have long in Charleston before he knows he might be caught. So he gets himself aboard a Boston-bound vessel in February of 1847. Now, I know all this because he wrote a very, very short memoir of his life. So the first years of his life, I had this wonderful primary source. But Jackson lived a long and complicated life, and there's a lot he didn't put into his story. And that's really where my adventures in research began. He lived in, as I said, inland. That's important, so you get a sense of the distance he had to travel overland. One thing I really emphasize when I'm talking to my undergraduates in particular, when I tell these stories, is this is not the Underground Railroad, right? Nobody's helping him. Nobody's giving him money. No one's letting, he's not going from house to house, nothing like that. He's hiding on the road. He's on the road. He's hiding in the woods. He's trying to go through swampland. He's trying not to attract attention. And he tries to talk his way out of trouble whenever he's sort of questioned. And one of the first things that to know about Jackson is he was he was a talker. He could talk himself out of problems. Sometimes he talked himself into problems. And almost all the encounters and paper traces I would find of him would be people either complaining or praising his chatty, charming, and often plausible is the name that was often used to describe how he could talk his way out of problems. So here's a deed of trust I found in property records in South Carolina, but demonstrate how Louisa and Ginny were sent to a family relative who moved them to Georgia. And here's the runaway slave advertisement. Back then, wasn't even microfilm, some of the newspapers in Sumter County when I first started this project some 15 years ago. But I knew generally the date when he would have left. And so I started studying and going through fugitive ads in all the local papers. And eventually I found this one $50 reward, a Negro man named Jackson. Now, was that his first name or his last name at that point? I don't know. He was about 30 years of age. And what I loved about this were two things. One, the speaks plausibly, which is a signal he's a liar. He's a talkative, persuasive liar, is what they're trying to convey. But also that they think he may have gone to Georgia looking for his wife. By the time this advertisement came out, actually, he was in Massachusetts. So it's very, very satisfying to think of them hunting in utterly the wrong direction by the time this ad actually came out. But we'll move on. And by 1850, he shows up in the Boston census. He shows up at Henry Foreman's boarding house for colored seamen. With you there at that point, he's calling himself Andrew Jackson. And I knew at first I thought Andrew Jackson's a pretty common name. It could have been anybody. But in his memoir, Jackson speaks of Henry Foreman as his friend, and he speaks of sailors who helped him, black sailors who helped him on the ship that he used he smuggled himself onto out of Charleston. And one of them was named Dennis. And so I was able to find in this list of black sailors at a black boarding house, a sailor named Dennis. So it sort of lined up all of my fact checking. In Massachusetts, his first interest was to earn money to buy Louisa and little Jenny. So he works in a tannery in Salem and he starts speaking in public a little bit to try to share the story and to get donations and also to get legal help. I spent a lot of time in my book, I won't spend it time here, but talking about the legalities of an enslaved person raising money. They can't really hold bank accounts very easily, or they aren't trusted to hold money. They have to have like a white guarantor. You need lawyers involved. And remember, if you're trying to liberate somebody out of bondage or captivity, you're dealing with what I'm going to call bad faith actors. So there's a fascinating paper trail, thanks actually to donors in Worcester and in Springfield and lawyers and families who try to donate a little bit of money, but also help try to facilitate some sort of communication with the captors down south who are keeping his wife and baby or little girl enslaved. And he almost gets it. He almost gets enough money. He almost makes it happen. But before he can, the Fugitive Slave Act passes in 1850. And this time he starts fleeing to Canada. And this time he is helped by what we would call the Underground Railroad. He's running around on himself. The risk is his, really, but is getting some financial donations. He sort of knows house to house where to go. And he slowly makes his way up through Massachusetts and Maine. As he gets up into Maine, he runs into, and I'll explain this, the family of Harriet Beecher Stowe. At that time, just a magazine writer. Hadn't done anything notable or national at that point. And she hides him. And I'll tell you about that. And then she started writing Uncle Tom's Cabin about 4 weeks maybe, after she encountered Andrew Jackson. So we can think about that time juxtaposition. In spring 1851, he makes his way to Canada. He remarries there, a woman named Julia Ann Watson Jackson. Believes that Louisa is dead for whatever reason. Julia was also a fugitive. She was a runaway from North Carolina. I don't know much about Julia's story, but I think she must have been a really interesting, powerful person. So she figures throughout the next 20 years of Jackson's life in an interesting way. Here's some letters, some of from the Reverend Samuel Osgood. There were letters from the Chase family. The papers are at the Antiquarian Society. African American minister activist Henry Highland Garnett and others from Worcester, Northampton, collecting money, trying to find ways that poor Jackson can free his wife. So, in Jackson's narrative, which I studied when I first got to South Carolina for my job, I wanted to learn about the enslaved people here and the history of it. And I came across this narrative. And he had this little, just paragraph and a half, really, where he says, I may mention that during my flight from Salem to Canada, I met with a very sincere friend and helper who gave me refuge during the night and set me on my way. And her name was Mrs. Beecher Stowe. She took me in and fed me and gave me some clothes and $5. She inspected my back. Right. So when I read this, I thought he was sort of exaggerating his connection to her. And I looked in some of the biographies of Stowe, and nobody mentions Jackson. It didn't, I couldn't make sense of it until I saw, and I didn't discover this letter. This letter is well known among Stowe scholars, but it was unpublished at the time I found it. I mean, I looked at it, which was at Yale University, in which Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote a letter to her sister, and it was an undated letter, but scholars have put it in late December of 1850. And she talks about an enslaved man who comes to her door. And she doesn't give his name, but she spends a couple of paragraphs talking about the incident. And what I realized was this directly corresponds with Jackson's own account. Here's the house. She had moved up there because her husband had a job teaching at Bowdoin College for various reasons. Her husband was not at home that month, those weeks. And she was there with several of her many children, including a very tiny baby at that point. And she talks of this incident to her sister. And she talks about going over to her neighbor, the Reverend Upham. And Reverend Upham was sort of a square, I think I'm going to say, like a really lovely man, but sort of conservative. And he didn't like the fugitive slave law, but he of course, felt it was the law and he had to obey it. And so she argued with him. He and I had over the tea table the other night that sort of argument, which consists in both sides saying over and over just what they should said before for any length of time. But when I asked him flatly if he would obey the law, supposing a fugitive come to him, Mrs. Upham laughed and he hemmed and hawed, and little Mary Broad said, I wouldn't know. Well, the next day there comes along a fugitive bound for Canada, and Smythe, now that's a math professor at Bowdoin, so I'll cheer the math professors. And Smythe sends him right up to Professor Upham, who takes him into his study and hears his story, gives him $1, and Mrs. Upham puts in bountifully for the provision line. And then he comes here for lodging. Now our beds were all full, and before this law passed, I might have tried to send him somewhere else. As it was, all hands in the house united in making him up a bed in our waste room, and Henry and Freddie and Georgie seemed to think they could not do much for him. They hung around him and seemed never to tire of hearing him talk and sing. He was the genuine article from the old Carolina state. And I looked at this, and there's all sorts of astonishing things. But one of the clues that I found most interesting was that phrase, old Carolina state, that she had put in quotes. And it was a popular culture reference. It was a song, a minstrel song that had just come out. And John Andrew Jackson quotes that same song in his memoir some years later. He puts all the lyrics to Old Carolina State into his own memoir. So we know he knew that song and sang it all the time. He talks about performing it in England later years. So it seems this directly corresponds and correlates. And indeed, one of my proudest academic achievements is I helped contribute to the fact that the house up in Bowdoin, which is still standing, up in Brunswick, it's still standing in Maine, is now recognized by the federal government as a site for freedom seekers, an Underground Railroad National Freedom Site. And I'm very proud that this documentation I was able to cover helped save the house and get it that recognition. Okay, I'm going to fly you through some of his crazy later decades. Hold on to your hats. From Canada, he becomes radicalized. He goes to Britain with his second wife, Julia. He gives over 50 or 60, actually, independent lectures in Scotland and England. He's not really sponsored by the Anti-Slavery Society. He's sort of a free, independent, contractor. He's trying to raise money, still to raise now. He's trying to raise money to free his father and other relatives that are enslaved. He joins the Reverend Spurgeon's huge London tabernacle, and with the help of this very prestigious figure in the Baptist community in England who publishes sermons all the time, that religious press, publishes The Experience of a Slave in South Carolina, 1862. He falls out with Spurgeon, and he publishes a crazy, furious little pamphlet about how angry he is with Spurgeon. Whether rightly or wrongly, he accuses Spurgeon of having embezzled money that was collected on his behalf. And there's some other issues too. But in the screed, he's like, and there's alcohol in the basement, and he wouldn't let me go to Sunday school. And he's just so mad at Spurgeon. So fair or unfair, that his book never got distributed in the United States. And that is indeed one of the reasons why his story is so little known. Now, the Reverend Spurgeon is a fascinating character in this book. Spurgeon was known as the Prince of Preachers. It's estimated that in his lifetime he preached over to 10 million people. He was unquestionably the best known Baptist of the 19th century and is a revered figure in the conservative sort of Baptist tradition worldwide. Now, important in England at that time, right, of course, slavery had been ended in the British Empire some decades earlier, but there's still activists who are very concerned about things going on in the United States. Spurgeon was not an activist on this. It wasn't his primary focus. I went through concordances of his thousands and thousands of sermons and public speaking and private letters, and the only time he mentioned slavery really is slavery is sin. But he did meet with Jackson. He was moved by Jackson, and he invited Jackson to speak to his congregation. Um, and then he let Jackson print the story of his life with Spurgeon's press. I think I have note it says by Andrew Jackson. I can talk about literacy later. I have reason to believe John Andrew Jackson was fairly literate. I believe he learned, perhaps starting in Canada, to read and write, partially because some of his work is quite smooth. Like I think there was an editor and people helping him with this one, but later on, I have letters that he clearly signed himself that have consistent handwriting associated with them. So, literacy is a spectrum, but I think he owned this story, and I believe he pretty much wrote it himself with editorial help from some of the Spurgeon circle. But by late 1865, because he's had this big fight with Spurgeon and the Civil War is over, he goes back to Massachusetts. He works informally with the Freedmen's Bureau and raising money. One of the most beautiful documents I have is from the Antiquarian Society, which is a poster, a broadside that was made at this period. He settles in Springfield, Massachusetts. He's there, then he was in New Haven, then he's in Springfield, then he's in New Haven. He shows up all over the place. He's in New England newspapers. He has lots of adventures going between New England and South Carolina. Advertisements will say, John Andrew Jackson is going to be in Springfield at this wharf this Friday and is accepting donations that he will then take down to Charleston and distribute to the free people of Sumter County. Here's one of the beautiful things from the broadside held at the American Antiquarian Society. Here he's speaking on a boat in Salem, which is sort of a nice way to think somebody going to speak on a boat. You can control the audience and collect tickets that way. And there was going to be singing. And here's a typical, sorry, it's a bad image, newspaper listing of from the 1870s saying he's going to purchase land. He's going to try to establish a home and a school. So did he do these things? Not very successfully. Was he corrupt? Was he collecting money for himself? Maybe a little bit. I think it's sort of a mixed bag. He had to survive. He's collecting money, and no school was ever built, no church was ever built, no orphan asylum was ever built. But I do have some documents suggesting he did distribute free goods to enslaved people or the freed people, sorry, in the areas of Sumter County. So, maybe mixed bag. Here's a photograph I took from the current, which is exactly where the big English house would have been. There's still cotton there today. Just wanted to show you that image. Barley owned by some international conglomerate, but it's a striking scene. And here's a scene of the English family mill property. Jackson later tries to buy the mill property in the 1860, 67, 1868. He wants to settle black families there. And I have documentation where he was writing to General O. Howard himself, trying to raise money. But that dream never came to be. A little black settlement that Jackson wanted to found didn't happen on the English family property. Gotta love the audacity of that. And instead, we have the Lee County Correctional Facility. So there's a story of carceral history and site use to sit with in your heart for a little bit. In the very late years, his late wife dies. He shows up throughout New Haven. He has adventures, and he's arrested in North Carolina. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to tell you one last little story about Springfield, and then I'm going to wrap up his life with a coda. So I was going through newspapers, recently digitized newspapers, and I found out he was arrested in North Carolina. Is this we'll see how it happened. So this is the first note I saw. Surrey Court adjourned in Saturday. In 1881, John Andrew Jackson, colored, was sentenced to work on the railroad for obtaining money under false pretenses. Didn't know anything. I dove into the North Carolina records, which told me very little. I found he was found guilty for fraud, He was condemned to 5 years hard labor on a chain gang. He was about 56 years old, and that's basically a death sentence, considering the death rates of people on chain gangs in those days. And yet, another newspaper article said he escaped. That's like, what? What? Then he was listed as recaptured in September. I don't know. And then he somehow is delivering a lecture in Vermont in 1881. So this is where the archive both failed me and confounded me. How do we put this together? And so I have a moment of speculation to share, but I think it's grounded. I think it's sort of beautiful. But let me show you what I put together. And I'm careful to say this is my speculation here about what happened that explains these events. Because in August of 1881, a dozen newspapers across the country, mostly in New England, but some others, suddenly had a little filler paragraph appearing randomly on their page, which said this thing about Mr. John Andrew Jackson, formerly a slave. He escaped from bondage. He afterward lectured through England. He has been working on behalf of freedmen soliciting. It says nothing else about him. There's no, why is this suddenly appearing in all these newspapers? I couldn't figure it out. And it's not a news item, right? It's a character testimonial, really. And what I believe happened is that Jackson, during his 2 week escape, may have gotten some white person to contact the Springfield Republican. The Springfield Republican, the editors of the Springfield Republican, had been publishing Jackson's stuff more than anybody else. They were, of course, they had invented the Republican Party, basically, at the Springfield Republican. And they had long been sort of a really, the most progressive newspaper in the country in terms of race relations and civil rights. And he was friendly with them. And so I think he somehow got somebody to write a letter on his behalf to contact the editor saying, please, I'm in jail in North, or I'm incarcerated in North Carolina. Can you get me out? And so rather than, getting overly involved, they just put out this innocuous little notice to say he is who he said he was, because sure enough, he somehow shows up in Vermont. And I think what happened was the North Carolina authorities were just sort of quietly agreed to just let him get the hell out of the state and just like never come back in this state again. And we'll just pretend this didn't happen. Because there's no court release or anything like that. He technically should have, served his entire sentence, but he clearly did not. So I'm pretty sure it was the good people in the Springfield Republican who stepped up to make a difference. But all right, we're wrapping it up here. So in 1893, he's being interviewed by papers and he says, I came back to this country after the war. I'm getting old and feeble. I only want to live till I get the money for the home. And then I will go down to Old Carolina. There's that phrase again, right? And there is where I want to die, down in my old cabin home. So what happened to Jackson? I've never been able to find a death notice or a grave, and I have searched some swampy cemeteries. It was not pleasant, but I've done the footwork. Haven't yet found his grave, but I did find a presence of Jackson. So in my research, I was looking into cotton. What is it like to grow cotton in Sumter County at the time of Jackson's bondage? Because cotton's different. It's different in every state. It's different every decade. It's handled differently according to the era. So I decided to look at interviews with 20th century interviews from the WPA narratives. And I found a narrative with a man who had been enslaved in Lynchburg, Jackson's town. And it was 1937 he gives the interview. And I nearly fell out of my chair because Jack McLeod starts saying, I hear tell about one man running away from Black Creek and going to Free State. Catch ride with people that used to travel to Charleston, hauling cotton and things. He come back about 15 years after the war and lived in that place adjoined to me. Came back with barrels and boxes of old secondhand clothes. Talk a good deal about how he associated with the whites. Don't know how come he run away, but they didn't catch up with him till it was too late. And there indeed I found in 1898 Sumter County, a little tiny crappy piece of land, was exchanged between John Andrew Jackson to someone else, a lawyer who bought it for bankruptcy or something. But you could see it is adjoined to a Jake McLeod. So I know that Jackson's presence was there with the Black oral history through the 20th century. My mother was born in the late 1830s, late 1930s. I'm just only one generation really away from people who knew Jackson. So to end, I'll say his story isn't really known among historians of the field, but it was known among the Black community. And Harriet Beecher Stowe, a couple of weeks after he left, had a revelation and began writing Uncle Tom's Cabin. And I do believe that she never in her life hid anyone in her house. It was really an audacious violation of norms that she did that. I think it's one thing to be abstractly an abolitionist, it's another thing to bring someone into your house, into your home at night when your husband isn't even there, no one else is there, no servants were there at that point, probably not at any rate. Um, so it's how this intersection happened is part of a bigger story. If you know Uncle Tom's Cabin, there's a scene not with the character Uncle Tom, but there's a scene with a character named Eliza who goes to the door of a house of people who are arguing about the fugitive slave law, and that exact scene that Stowe wrote in her letter about her neighbors arguing sort of manifests in the book Uncle Tom's Cabin, that same incident. So thank you for your patience as I flew through this very complicated life. It's really a pleasure to talk to you. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Susanna. It's a fascinating life and a fascinating book. And I think what I'd like to ask you about a little bit is to talk about the process by which you wrote the book. So
Mm.
how does an English professor who's teaching literature come to write this book, which is very much a documents-based historical book, obviously with places where we don't know what happened, but it really is the work of a terrific historical sleuth as well as an English professor.
Well, thank you so much. Well, when I first got my position here at Clemson University in South Carolina, I didn't know anything about South Carolina. I didn't know where I'd land. I certainly didn't know I'd spend 28 years building my life here. All my children are South Carolinians. It's crazy. But my campus is a big public university, and it's on the site of a plantation labor camp. Not just any, it is on John C. Calhoun's property. And nobody wanted to talk about it. Nobody had the vocabulary. My students would walk by this building, this antebellum building every day, and they could scarcely identify what it was or who Calhoun was. And I'm not saying it was like evil oppression of history, but it seemed so uncomfortable to talk about. And so I decided, where do we start in this world? As we always should start with what's uncomfortable, and we should walk towards that. So I started working with student groups because I think the best research often begins with student groups. And I started trying to teach enslaved narratives of the Carolinas. And that led to some book projects and magazine projects and research projects. And I came across Jackson's book narrative, and it was witty. I mean, is that okay to say? Like witty and funny? Despite the horror that he is providing testimony to, he has a lot of little asides. One of my favorite was he talks about being in Charleston and sort of hiding around the docks, trying to figure out how to get on a boat. And somebody comes up to him and challenges him, "Who do you belong to?" And he does not have a good answer. So he goes, I belong to South Carolina, which is a nonsensical answer. And the person was like, "What?" and sort of walked away. And Jackson wrote in his memoir, "It was none of their business who I belonged to. I was trying to belong to myself." And he's lots of little asides like that. They give you a sense of this sort of real personality just calling out. So now, the one thing I can say is while I love this is a book about archives, each chapter opens with a document, a receipt, a census data, a census piece, a letter, a narrative of someone else. So each document, a court case document opens each chapter because I want to talk about how do we look at archives in new ways. Black people don't show up easily unless it's often in a negative context in court records, for example. So how do you read within the margins for a more fuller life? So I really try to talk about new approaches to archival research in an accessible, sort of friendly way, because I think these documents are really available to everybody now, thanks to the modern digital era we're in. So it's a little bit of a case study to show people things and questions they can bring to documents to see them in new ways.
That's one of the most appealing things about the book, in fact, is the way you're not just talking about what happens to Jackson, but you're talking about the paper trail by which we can find Jackson and not just find him, but also hear his voice as he crosses from the south to the north and then to Canada and then across the ocean. I mean, to what extent do you see yourself as having a responsibility to not just to find the voices, but also to let them speak?
Well, in my case, I'm lucky. He would have loved it. He was a talker, right? He wanted his story told. He felt it was desperately important. He tried to tell his story every way he could, and it was often ignored and written off. And he was, I found notices in Connecticut newspapers that said, if you see John Andrew Jackson, he's a fraud. Do not give him any money. He's a criminal. So he really had to push against that. And again, I feel when when I had my wonderful fellowship at Yale, I was able to find a church building that was still standing, built from 1831 when it was built, and I know that that congregation had donated a significant amount of money that was then brought down to my state of South Carolina to feed the poor and tools so they could farm and hose and even I can clothes. And I know that came from that church. And I don't know, maybe it's silly, but I went up to the church and I just like patted it. And I was like, okay, church people of the 19th century, I know there were people challenging Jackson, but I know I've seen actual receipts from the Freedmen's Bureau. Your donations were delivered. They did make it down, and I'll say thank you. So I like thinking of how entwined our states are in our nation. We think of our nation as so far apart, and we've always been so tightly tied together.
And it's fascinating to think about that for the 19th century, when getting from one place to another
Oh,
was was challenging, especially if you're fleeing enslavement. I mean, that brings to mind the picture on the front of his pamphlet, which is also on your book, and it's the slide you have up currently. Tell us about that picture of Andrew Jackson on a horse.
well, that's the only image I have of him, and he would have overseen it because this was put together by an engraver in London. And I talk about the street where the engraver was, where his house was like a block or so away, or his home was a block or so away from where the engraver was. So I'm sure he stood over the engraver and told him what to do. And it's ridiculous, okay? I say that with love. Look, he's wearing a tie, he's got a waistcoat, he's got checked pants, he's got this snappy looking hat, he's like tipping it off to you. The horse looks like a beautiful racehorse going really fast. Okay, this is not how enslaved people in Sumter, Carolina dressed. It is clearly not what he would have worn. His horse would not have looked like that. But this is what he wanted to sell. Like, this is how he wanted to be presented. And I just love that he wanted to be seen like this. It really, again, tells you of his personality. It's the only image we have of him, really. So yeah, that's why it was clear I really wanted his presence. And also a shout out to my wonderful press, the new press, because they let me have a lot of illustrations, which, as anybody knows, is not that common in publishing. And so they not only that, they even let me geek out. Where I was like, a picture of a census page is not like a sexy, attractive image, but it was really important for me to show documents throughout the book. So there are a lot of images, but the most important image is this one thing I have of Jackson, and that's who he is with
It's
that sparkle.
It's a great image with that sparkle. It's also a man in motion, and it's reminiscent of other images of the time of racehorses and jockeys on racehorses.
Indeed.
This is not a guy who, somehow manages to get a pony and get
Mhm.
that pony up to escape on a pony. This is a guy who's moving. He's really moving. We've got questions already starting to come in from
Sure.
listeners, and so I think I'll just get into some of those. Nazira Wright says, "Thank you, Susanna." Whoops, there we go. Thank you, Susanna. Can you talk about the process of writing a biography on a 19th century Black personally, using pieces and scraps of materials to tell a rich story? Your book on Jackson brings in larger issues such as land ownership, the establishment of businesses, carceral history, etc. Is this technique, incorporating larger social issues, necessary to write biographies of 19th century people?
What a reader Nazira Wright must be. The perfect reader for my book. I don't know if it's all, I mean, any biography is going to need context. But I think when you're dealing with somebody who has been deliberately left out of a historical record, that you have it, the onus is that much more to try to put them within a larger context of history. For example, one of my early chapters, uh, I focus on a narrative written by a man named Irving Lowry. Irving Lowry survived bondage, and in freedom, he was a minister in South Carolina, a black minister, and he wrote a memoir of his own life on a plantation site. And it's one of those sort of difficult narratives because it's almost nostalgic. It says like very nice things. Oh, I had, there were terrible enslavers, but my master was quite nice, and we had lots of food, and there were many interesting times, and some things were difficult, but it wasn't that bad. It's really, you know, it's how Lowry chose to remember his history. Lowry was also asking white people for money for his church a lot. So he wanted very good relationship with all the white people of the church. But anyway, he talks about going to church meetings. And I suddenly realized Lowry and Jackson had been talking about the same church meetings that they had gone to, or camp meetings, and that you had these sort of, oh, I didn't know much about Jackson's perspective, but I knew of another black man living at a labor camp next to him who had gone to the same events, and they actually knew some of the same people. And that was a gift, but it suddenly meant I had to build out a context for this young man, Irving Lowry, who, you know, Jackson wrote before emancipation. So Jackson's story is very angry and to expose the horror. Well, you have I needed a bigger context to talk about someone like Lowry, who's using memory in a very different way, writing in the 1880s. That's the kind of context I found very challenging, but important and sort of a real privilege to try to bring together.
I think also that the contextual work helps fill in some of what might be the gaps in Jackson's own life in the documents that you've gotten from Jackson's life story. It helps us understand how document A might link to document B when we don't have the intervening document. Um, we've got a bunch of questions here that are asking more about Jackson himself. So Gabrielle McCoy asked, one of our current fellows at AAS asks, she says, thank you for this wonderful talk. Here are a few questions. Do we know what happened to his first wife and his daughter Ginny, or why his second wife was committed to an asylum? Finally, in his memoir, does he discuss the horse he rode to escape in any substantial way? His character, the name of the horse, anything like that?
Okay, I'll start with the wives. So the first story, and everybody out, I think this really tugs at the heart of any audience or reader I have. What happened to Louisa and little Ginny? Um, Jackson, at one point, there's an interview where he says, "Well, I learned my wife was dead, so therefore I married another woman in Canada." I have to say, I don't know if that's true. He may have just given up, like there is no chance of us ever being reunited, and so we have to carve out new lives. And I'm not here to judge anything about that. I think there were many people who had very hard decisions to make because I don't have clear evidence that Louisa survived, but I think she might have. There's a woman named Louisa Law, which was the family name of her enslavers, who moves back from Georgia right after the war to that same town. She's married to another black man and has sort of started a new family. I don't Little Ginny seems to have disappeared from history. But I look at that and I think maybe Louisa also started a new family and a new life. And again, I'm very careful in how I speculate because I don't want to presume. But it also might explain why Jackson goes back and forth. He sort of has two families in the decades after the war. For 40 years, he's going between South Carolina and Massachusetts back and forth. And that may be because it's not just his brothers and sisters and his elderly father who are still there. It might also be his first wife. And he has sort of obligations to both groups. Julia Jackson, Julia's so great. Somebody's got to write more about Julia. That's someday. Julia actually when he was in England, she accompanied him throughout England, and she's mentioned in many of the newspaper stories. And they talk a little bit about it. I get clues about her crazy escape from North Carolina. But after, on one or two incidents, she takes the stage. And this was very rare for a woman to take the stage. And actually, I do speculate she might have been the first black woman to first, black and formerly enslaved black woman to speak on stage anywhere in England or the UK, because it's really not common and it doesn't happen much often until later. So yeah, that's really, and what did he wrote in his letters that she was very troubled and very lonely. I saw some letters where he mentions that, and he troubled, right? And then he said she's very ill. She's taken very ill, he says in a letter. And he tries to get, I think, a niece or nephew of his, some young child. And so he says, I want to bring this teenage girl up from South Carolina so she can keep my wife company. he says, and she can get an education. And he doesn't quite manage to make that happen. But then a year later, I see that Julia in a newspaper article is sent to the Northampton Insane Asylum, which sounds pretty terrible, but it was state of the art. It was filled with gardens. The idea was give people like gardens and labor and sunshine, and maybe they'll get better. I don't know. Did she have epilepsy? Did she have schizophrenia? Was she depressed? Did she just have migraines? I mean, the 19th century, it could have been anything, bless her. But in a year or two later, she's reported as dead. So
Yeah.
about the horse. He
The
called it a
horse.
pony the whole time. And he does say that he traded sort of a black market trade with another black man. He gives a bunch of chickens to another man who has this pony, and he hides the pony in the woods. He never gives the name to the pony. But then he's such a show off. He can't resist it. He gets on the horse and he goes to an event, meeting, and all these black people in the neighborhood see him on the horse, which is again sort of stolen. He's not supposed to be on. It was a bad move, but you could see he just couldn't resist like being on a horse. He's that kind of personality, and that's part of the reason that he then has to flee because he knows he's going to get in trouble for having been seen on a horse.
Yeah, I mean, for better or worse, he's a showman. He really is.
He is. He is.
Yeah. Ron Waddell here in Worcester says, thank you for this story and wonderful talk. Did anywhere in his memoir did he speak to the specifics of the people or places in Worcester who helped or hindered his efforts?
Oh, I wanted that question. Okay. There is in my book, and I'm going to make it, there is a letter in the Antiquarian Society that I reference. And the letter in the Antiquarian Society is in the Chase family papers, I believe. And it's just one little, two or three sentences, but basically is like, dear lawyer in the Chase family, please hold on to these $2 that I heard Jackson speak, and I'd like to donate this to his family. And I looked up the name of the guy, and the guy was like a small farmer. I mean, he was a farmer in some tiny, tiny place right outside of Worcester. Clearly, this isn't a man with money or means. And he was enclosing $2 to try to help Jackson. And I love that somebody who had so little, we have a trace of somebody opening their heart. And it's a risk. Maybe Jackson wasn't speaking truth. Maybe that money would never get to the South Carolina to buy freedom, but he was going to trust that it could and that it would. And we have that little receipt of that letter in the American Antiquarian Society as testimony to love, I think.
It's a great story. And I want to put in a plug here for something we're doing at AAS right now. We are just completing a grant project to digitize a number of the materials in that Chase family collection. The Chase sisters went to the South to be teachers to formerly enslaved people. And then a number of those formerly enslaved people wrote letters to them after they returned to Massachusetts. So we're going to be making all of those digitally accessible, open access through our website in the next few months. So it's exciting, and we'll get some of those sources out there. An anonymous attendee also thanks you for your talk and says you mentioned that John Andrew Jackson became literate and traveled from the South to the North. Did he ever publish in some of the African American newspapers that were emerging at the time, such as Freedom's Journal or Christian Recorder? Also, did he speak publicly in early AME churches and/or African American led Masonic lodges?
Well, I can answer that a little bit. He didn't publish much of anything until he got to England. So his connection with American journals and magazines was small. He did, however, his when he was traveling around Massachusetts trying to raise money early on, his situation was covered by the Liberator. And so the Liberator paid attention to him and actually reprinted some of the documentation. So Garrison and all the Liberator crew of 1849 knew of Jackson well. And indeed, one of the reasons I know this is because there is a clipping from the Liberator that is at the American Antiquarian Society in some of these files that Jackson must have been carrying the clipping around to say, look, this validates my story. So.
Yeah, we've got several questions related to the Uncle Tom's Cabin connection.
Please.
Ellen Miles asks if you're familiar with the with Josiah Henson, the Maryland slave who escaped to Canada in 1830 and published a memoir of his life in 1849 that Harriet Beecher Stowe credited as an inspiration for the character of Uncle Tom.
Yeah. Well, absolutely. I'm well aware of Josiah Henson. He's an incredible man, had an incredible life. Um, the evidence, although he did occasionally, he sort of walked it back, but he did at one point sort of let himself be promoted as sort of an Uncle Tom character. And Harriet Beecher Stowe did write an introduction to one of his memoirs. And I don't think his story conflicts with Jackson's exactly. Jackson never went around saying he did have Jackson had a letter from Stowe that he carried around in England, and we know that. Because ministers get, well, I saw the letter written by Harriet Beecher Stowe that introduces him, and this was very credible, and but so we know she knew him and wrote with him and back and forth. Um, Stowe actually, when she talks about, she doesn't say Uncle Tom that Josiah inspired Uncle Tom. The one her closest thing she says is in her book, A Key to Uncle Tom's Cabin. She says there are many his life parallels things in my book. And
Mhm.
there actually is very sketchy evidence that she met him before she wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. Even the biographer of Henson, there's a great new biography of Henson coming out very soon. I've been reading, but even the scholars of Henson have no evidence that she met Henson or read his or was aware of his life story before she wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, or at least before she had already started Uncle Tom's Cabin. So I don't think these stories contradict each other. I think Josiah Henson is part of that story. And as I said, if anything, Jackson's a character like Eva has actions that are sort of based on Jackson more than Uncle Tom or any other characters. So I think literature and literary influences are complicated, and we create art from all sorts of things. But I do stand by my premise that it's one thing to be abstractly abolitionist. And it's another thing to actually bring someone into your house, into your home. And that I think that changes you, that kind of direct action. And so I think it was part of the process that, she would say God inspired her. I mean, that's what God wrote her
Right,
book
right.
for her. So, inspiration's complicated. I maybe prefer the word instigate, but yes. And Josiah Henson, his beautiful, brave story is certainly part of this as well.
Yeah, and by the way, that question came from Jarvis Young, who's another current fellow at AAS. He's a faculty member at the University of Arkansas, working on late 18th and early 19th century African American uh, polemical tracts and
Oh,
pamphlets.
fascinating. Yeah.
Great stuff. Dee Andrews asks, also thanks you for the talk, and she asks about whether Jackson shows up in Stowe's A Key to Uncle Tom's Cabin, which she publishes several years later.
No, he does not. No, he's not. But I don't even know if she ever knew his name. All right. Well, she did. She would have by 1856 because he's up in Canada and he writes her a letter saying, "Can you please write me? I'm going to go to England. An introduction from you, a character reference would be valuable." So by 1856, she definitely has like knows his full name, but they may never have exchanged names during his hiding, actually.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, and so she wouldn't talk about it. We have some questions about your process and also about your teaching. So Cynthia Patterson raises Sadia Hartman's work on the idea of critical fabulation, and she says it seems this is what you're doing in A Plausible Man. Were you aware of the notion of critical fabulation as you finalized this book project?
Oh, I love Hartman and I love the notion of critical fabulation. I wouldn't really use that term exactly for what I do. Because I'm very careful throughout, because I'm so interested in documents, I really want to say what we know this and can we presume this? I think I have one or two moments where maybe I do dip into critical fabulation saying, I'll write things like, he must have been frightened, right? And of course, maybe he wasn't. Maybe he was laughing at that moment. I don't know. But I am, so there are a couple of moments of maybe where I am overstepping, perhaps. But as a reader, as a human, there are little moments like that. But overwhelmingly, I try to be very conscious about that and careful so that people can judge whether or not they think where the line is that I may or may not have crossed. I like to make those very visible. But critical fabulation is a helpful tool for these very difficult histories. As I said, for example, in Canada, I know a lot about his life in certain places, but in Canada, he's there for 6 years. And I know very little. There was a terrible fire in New Brunswick in the city of St. John that destroyed most of their city records. I know he registered to vote, which I love. He was going to be a Canadian citizen. He was really invested in building a life in Canada. And, I mean, 2 years earlier or 3 years earlier had been in the cotton fields, and here he was registering to vote in Canada. It's really beautiful. But basically, I know very little about what happened to him in Canada. So I have to dance around it respectfully and carefully and use the clues I have.
Yeah. And Barbara McCaskill asks if you could talk a bit about how you incorporate archival techniques you've learned during this research in your classroom teaching.
Well, I thank God for the librarians because there are a lot of skill sets I do not have. But in classes, I've done special projects with parallel things to this where I've brought in experts on census reading and how to do ancestry.com. And we'll sit around as a group and I'll say, okay, here's a character. We know, can we find the family that enslaved him? And we have these clues, but the names are, misleading. Let's play around with this. And how do how you can't do ancestry alone. You have to consult other people. You have to constantly talk with people because when you start staring at things too long, you need help. So a lot of this stuff, I've had great success showing my students the glory and the great opportunities we have of databases, and that there are still so many discoveries that are still made. I mean, we live in an era where even some local historical society in Wyoming discovers something and digitizes it for the first time, and then suddenly it tells a story to everybody back in Massachusetts or Florida, and it connects our journals and our newspapers, and our storytelling becomes possible. And students like that. They're really, the story is not over. It's not like we know all this history. We don't know many things, and these stories are still coming out. So I've had great success working with students with that kind of stuff. I've also, I mean, I mentioned digging around in cemeteries. I've gotten to know Jackson's ancestors, I mean, descendants rather. Some of his family took me all over swampland, and it was a little much for me. So I came back and I was with students, and I was like, okay, students, where are the boots? We're going to fan out through the swamps together. So students are good at that part too.
I've been saving this question for the very end because I think it's so wonderful and it connects a lot of dots. Meg Barker says, I live in Bath, Maine, and
Oh,
lead walking tours. The homeowner of the house where Stowe sent Jackson, Reverend Ellingwood, next, shared with me a letter you wrote him 10 years ago about these events that took place in Brunswick and Bath. I have been sharing this story for 4 years on my walking tours as we stand in front of Ellingwood's house. Your research has been reverberating in a very real way for many people here in Mid-Coast Maine. What else do you hope follows once someone has read your book?
oh, well, we've got to talk because I want to go back to Bath. I'd love to talk at the library there because although I didn't talk about it in this lecture, but in my book, after he's in Brunswick visiting and hides with Stowe, he goes to Bath. He meets another white guy, gives him some money there, and I'm pretty sure he hid, right? You hide if you're on the Underground Railroad, you're not going to really hide with white people. You're much more likely to hide with black people. And there was a black community in Bath there where he could have sort of been protected for a period of time until he made it to Canada. So I talk a little bit about Bath in my book, and indeed the Ellingwood connection is really wonderful. So what do I hope people? I hope people realize history is messy. Um, he might have been, as I said, he might have been a little bit of a charlatan, a bit of a hustler. He had to be to survive. History isn't always clean. And even with Frederick Douglass or the great abolitionist activists we know of, they often were very well connected and sort of they got sponsorships. And so they're written into a history. And you have this sort of, at one point, Jackson gets into some trouble in Scotland. He gets into a legal problem, and somebody says, "Well, we're gonna write to the American and Anti-Slavery Society and get them to verify your story." And he's like, "Who are they? I was enslaved. They never did anything for me. I never met anybody, and who are they to talk for me now? I'm insulted that you want some British activist to talk about me and my life. I'll tell you. I'll show you the scars on my back." And that really reminds you of like, again, people, it's not just being black or being poor or being sort of illegal in a country. There are all sorts of other reasons too when you're not necessarily connected or networked, where you don't fit an easy narrative.
That's wonderful. And Susanna, thank you so much for sharing A Plausible Man, both Jackson and your book with us. This has been delightful and wonderful. It's a fantastic book. I encourage everybody to go read it. If you're a faculty member teaching somewhere, it is eminently teachable. It would work great in classes. I want to thank also everybody in our audience tonight. If you'd like to recommend this program to friends, our public programs are all available on the AIS YouTube channel. We've got one more program coming up this summer. It's coming up next Tuesday night. It's another virtual program. Author Sarah Gold McBride will be talking about her brand new book, Whiskerology: The Culture of Hair in 19th Century America. You can register on our website, americanantiquarian.org. We take a break in August, but we'll be back in September with a whole new slate of fall programs, which you can find on the website. Susanna Ashton, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks. And to everybody, thank you and have a good evening.